Elfin Swinson let himself into Strangelove. In his wheelchair, he approached the desk of Aoife Sheridan with his tome of a mobile outstretched in his right hand. He stormed in, you could say. Talk about a one-track mind. He blatantly ignored Major Tom, the straight-up living skeleton, skulking in the corner of the room. A good day in the office, assumed the great detective. She rose from her chair, heaving stuck skin from the damp leather, decidedly interested in his refusal to remove his fur-lined trench coat or fluff-topped beanie at her request. They were in the midst of Ireland's hottest summer on record. His arm still bobbed in mid-air and would remain there until the detective took his phone from him. On it, a net group for those dabbling in esotericism which mentioned her shop by name. It was a discussion of vague urban legends along the lines of Bloody Mary, Sydney's cannibal nightclubs, and the story of the clever cat. It's not easy to find Strangelove by any means, but it does exist. You can find it in any nook and cranny when necessary, but it's polite to knock before entering. To prevent unfortunate chance encounters, Aoife kept a trick in her first room. Her receptionist, Hamilton, would often weed out the phonies, so it was rare of her to receive such a grand entrance. It stressed her out a little bit, and so her free hand went wandering to find the nearest drawer in her desk. In it, she found her safety blanket, a fistful of scrumpled scrap paper, which she brought to her face and huffed like gasoline, inhaling the scent of old books and dead silverfish. It helped calm her weary heart, some kind of comforting trigger. God knew that Aoife Sheridan needed some comfort, after all she'd been through to get here. Eventually, Elfin would give in to the strangeness of the situation. He cracked the bones in his fingers, cleared his throat, and asked for her by name. Witchdoctor, detective. You're listening to episode 7 of Pulp, Surreal Stories from a Nearby Skull, an audiozine presented by the Sleepy Bones Detective Agency. The following broadcast is intended for mature audiences only. Witchdoctor detective. She'd not heard that one before. A bit goofball, but Aoife liked it more than Yellowbelly, or Lovecraft, or all of the other names she'd been given. Plus, Macabre Investigator had already been trademarked. She confirmed her existence to him, not that he couldn't tell from the decor. The fabled occult detective. You'd need a particular story to warrant the attention of the famous Aoife Sheridan. Elfin told her that he had something. A case for her, he said. Just that had already told her everything she needed to know. That pause there. She took one last huff and returned her therapy paper to the desk drawer for future reference. Aoife's stress had evaporated, and that confused Elfin, who was dancing around the topic at hand. It was fair enough, she'd done the same, but in the grand scheme of things, you have to come to terms with it eventually. You can say it, she told him. You've got a parasite, right? Aoife tapped the side of her head. She had the same thing. Something had burrowed into the back of their heads, metaphorically speaking, of course. It was quite clear that Elfin got the picture, but he still preferred the term evil spirit over parasite. Less vivid, less admission of guilt. Again, fair enough. They prefer remnant, personally. Elfin had been possessed by this evil spirit for a while now, but it wasn't that grim a story. It spoke to him once, appeared in his sleep to discuss its terms with him, and then left him alone. Apparently, he'd been to Killarney National Park for a wander. This was way back in 1995. He probably picked up a rock, or a bit of bark shaped like something ominous. It's always best not to pick shit up in the woods. Aoife wasn't quite sure what year it was now, somewhere between 24 and 25 probably. Her word of the day calendar read 2013, but the word of the day was united. She'd scorned it before, a boring word. The people with the parasites didn't age, so they lost track of time, especially Aoife, who rarely left the sanctum of Strangelove. 30 years though? No trouble? That was unusual. They were chatty little things Aoife knew from experience, having hosted the remnant known as Nuberius for 200 some years. Elfin must have felt comfortable in the Witchdoctor's care as he began to remove his outer layers. Beneath them hid a dripping wet, beetroot red old man. He had eyes like crime scene marigolds, suggesting liver failure, or something along those lines. Fragile, to the point that, had he not been in his specific supernatural situation, the geezer would have boiled before he reached the door. Normally, you'd assume he was trying to protect his anonymity, but Aoife didn't recognize him in the slightest. From the waft of cologne freed from the real fur trim, to that stockbroker's suit tailored so snugly that his limbs looked like rolls of pennies, Elfin was a man of means, locally famous, perhaps. A golf club and cocktail bar charisma king, certainly not the kind of gentleman to be skulking around looking for witch doctors. It appeared to him in his dream the night after his trip, called itself Rakshasa, offered him a deal, then and there. Obviously at the time, Elfin believed it to be nothing more than a nightmare. He figured he'd eaten something off, or maybe it was just too bloody hot. From the state of him, Elfin wasn't far from the end 30 years ago, and the brain does funny things to you as you age. His story checked out in Aoife's experience. Possession had different effects on the human body, often unique to the remnant in question. Some of them come up on purpose, and they want something from you. Some of them get brought here and trapped by accident. It's their instinct as remnants to become whole once more. They can make you stronger, offer you unique abilities, or heal your wounds in seconds, but they all have one thing in common. A host cannot die a natural death. Remnants are immortal. And this trickles down into the host on a self-preservation kind of level. You never age, you never starve, you don't need to sleep, you don't even need to breathe, really. Aoife was only 20 years old when she underwent her transition, but this poor man would be forever 89. He had dentures that were still giving him sores, as well as stage 4 arthritis, leaving his grip strength shot. His eyesight teetered somewhere between legally blind and totally fucked, and he'd had plates drilled into his bones which were coming loose, but at this point he was 129 years old. He couldn't get a doctor to treat these issues, because they'd have to pull his medical records, and they'd section him. Elfin would remain in this state forever, or at least until somebody cut out his heart or pulled off his head. Unless, explained Elfin, Aoife Sheridan was willing to help him commit to Rakshasa's deal. Elfin needed her to find him a suitable replacement. Woof, she said. Let's slow down a minute there, Faust. Aoife took issue with her predetermined inclusion. She was on a government watch list at the moment, and as such, had to remain at least 40 yards from any invasion of the body snatchers one-man shows. Elfin claimed she'd misunderstood as he begged her to sit back down. It wasn't like that, not exactly, which, in retrospect, was not a good modifier to turn heads on. Rakshasa's deal was ironclad. The recipient of Elfin Swinson's original body must be a willing party. They must sign a physical contract written in Rakshasa's exact wording. Plus, the signatory has to know in their heart full well what they're signing. The phrase, "in their heart," was a familiar one. In all her years of documentation, she'd seen enough evidence to confirm that remnants were well aware of the concept of consent. There's lots of etiquette involved in getting here, let alone finding a host body. She had definitely never witnessed one use a physical contract. Fascinating. But what did it want? What was the goal here? Elfin explained. Rakshasa would leave him in their form and ask the same of the newcomer. Perpetual immortality. Just ask someone else to stop the world when you want to get off. Sounds fair? It left Aoife staring into space for a short while, as she processed the ramifications. In the end, she would accept the contract, and request that Major Tom bring out the old man a form to fill in. It would take Aoife Sheridan 2 weeks to get back to Elfin, and that was almost entirely because she had better things to be doing. Out of all of Strangelove's open requests at the time, Elfin's could have been done by any bonehead in the industry worth their license. Kooky premise or not, the boogeyman was well and truly within the public conscious these days. Aoife Sheridan had been drowning in this knowledge for years, but now even the government had official procedures to deal with the constant interdimensional cosmic creature shtick. Obviously, the paranormal had always been lurking in the shadows, but ever since that whole, "oh shit, nobody can die, what do we do?" era of human history, we're a little more aware of it all. Remember that? You probably don't. Not many people can recall the events between 2013 and 2014. Joshua Wall could. He was special. A curious little Welshman with rings of eczema around his eyes like a panda bear, and the build to match it. Timid too. He caught Aoife's eye from the get-go. Joshua had arrived with Kim, a willing participant in another one of Strangelove's projects. Moral support, supposedly. Joshua spent much of his time wandering around Strangelove, as though he was visiting a museum on an off day. Occasionally, his fingers would drift towards an ivory rosary he kept in his pocket, but never touched it. He would linger in the labyrinthian annals of Strangelove, which, suffice to say, stretched out a bit further than you'd imagine. Not every door goes back the way it came, to save space. Joshua returned to Aoife's sitting room around tea time, a little shaken up. They spoke the usual guff, but sooner or later it became clear that the two of them were on the same wavelength, so to speak. He asked her, out of intrigue, how much her investigation services would cost, hypothetically, of course. She smiled, scooted her leather recliner closer to him, and asked him to explain himself. A decade or two later, we call this event the Defiance. It happened in March of 2013, when one Joshua Aaron Wall was sat in the operator's chair of a Class 175 passenger train, driving his regular route towards Holyhead. He was somewhere between Cwmbran and Shrewsbury when our world felt the actions of Luponfontaine. A surge of overwhelming energies released at the time eviscerated a footbridge on the track, and in the ensuing crash, Joshua was speared through the heart. Now there's a death sentence. There's no medical technology in the world that could kiss that boo-boo better. But in this shaken reality, Cardiff's doctors had all the time in the world to reconstruct Joshua's shredded body. A surgery which lasted 55 days on and off, followed by about a year and a half of constant medically induced comas. Joshua had died in that accident. He had felt it happening, a warmth followed by a sudden euphoria. His mind slipped away and dreamt vividly as it continued to function against the will of nature, sleeping, dreaming, as though the Lord Almighty had brought him into his bosom and comforted him after a long life lived well. And then he woke up, and it was unpleasant here. His muscles had atrophied, but he could turn his head and breathe and see the packed hospital around him. With assistance, he could even sit up and touch his own cold, cold chest. Metal, a rudimentary breastplate guarding an artificial heart. In 2014, death would return once more, and it came in droves for those who had outlasted it. Still, Joshua Wall drew breath. And for what? Once upon a time, his life had been deeply rooted in his faith. Now, Joshua was driven by fear, and that was no life, was it? He didn't feel bitterness or hatred to those who had shown him this path in life. Rather, he simply realized that the God Almighty that he had worshipped was a product of human ingenuity. He had seen the evidence he'd seen because that's what he wanted to see, but if this heart was to fail, he wouldn't see anything. Not his mother, not his first dog, Judy, not his Lord and Saviour. He hadn't touched his tea, and so Aoife finished hers and offered the man Rakshasa's proposition. It wasn't a now or never decision, he would sit on it for half a week. To assist him, Aoife picked from her shelves some previously discarded trinket, a small plastic skull from an old Halloween decoration which he left with, believing it would bring him clarity, because she told him it would. On the day of Joshua's return, Aoife made the necessary calls. At a moment's notice, Elfin made his way to her shop as well, so that they could all put this behind them. The Witchdoctor would lead the two of them through the towering mass of Strangelove to a distant and unfinished room where she would conceive the document and oversee the proceedings. According to Rakshasa, the ritual required both parties to be stood. To avoid complication, Aoife had the two of them strapped to upturned church pews drilled into the ground. She'd gone to a lot of effort for this. Joshua and Elfin were positioned in front of each other, so that when the latter outstretched his shivering fingers, the former could rest the tips of his own against them. There was a great strength in Joshua. His breath slowed as he prepared to strike his greatest fear right between the eyes. A risk from which he could return immortal, or, well, he had nothing to lose really, did he? Elfin felt the same, surely. At this point, he'd already fulfilled his part of the bargain. Regardless of the outcome, Rakshasa would leave him for Joshua, and Elfin could live what was left of his life in peace. And that was all he wanted, wasn't it? With that in mind, it was still difficult to witness the moment Rakshasa initiated the transition. Even from a distance, Aoife could see movement beneath their skin, as though thousands of beetle eggs had hatched at once, clambering to free themselves from the trapping fibers of their muscles. From their screams, it was evident that each bubble brewed beneath their surface brought forth an agony unknown. Elfin's jaw clenched so hard that some of his false teeth shattered. The tighter skin soon split like cheesecloth around the heels, between the armpits, and at the groin. Once loosened, it warped and slid across muscle, as though pulled upwards by strings. A sore, leaking tumour of flesh bunched at the summit of their opposing shoulders, leaving only an arm unsheathed. Elfin's on the right, Joshua's on the left. All the hair had been ejected from their bodies, piling around their feet. The same was true for their fingernails, likely to avoid any unnecessary scratching. Aoife could see their respective faces still intact, deflated like B-movie props waiting to be fitted, their bare meat exposed to the elements, the shock of which forced their eyes to bulge out of their skulls. The dripping of viscous fluids onto untextured concrete reverberated around the room, staining the now forgotten empty chamber. The smell would linger in the air as they stood shivering, wet and naked for almost 3 minutes. Aoife inspected the exposed damage of Elfin's weakened frame, his broken metal legs, and the uncomfortable curvature of his crooked spine. Then, she saw the silver box that contained Joshua's plastic heart. It jutted out at several right angles, poking through shredded strips of pectoral muscle. She could almost hear it whirring to keep up with the demand. After a twitch and a throb, the two masses of skin leapt from one body to another. It clung to the opposing flesh like molten steel, and began to adapt to the shape of its new host symbiotically. The screaming had stopped by now. Aoife had clocked it earlier, but it was taking some doing to get Elfin's face onto Joshua's skull. Soon, the faces were slipped on like wrestling masks, as the rest of the flesh seeks out and coats the remaining nakedness, down the back, across the hips, towards the feet, and still, some remained. A leathery mass of aged and unwell yellowed skin had failed to graft correctly. As this new coating was plumbed into his circulatory system, confused blood rushed to those sagging wings. Saddlebags. He'd carry them until the sun burned out. Elfin. It didn't matter how he looked. His permanence was never part of the discussion. Aoife should have figured that one out. He wouldn't have to live with the guilt, so 2 birds with 1 stone, really. She couldn't hear Joshua breathing, but he no longer needed to. Rakshasa had made the jump between host bodies, leaving Joshua with the gift of immortality. It was unlikely that the flesh would heal one day. But even if it did, there was no sign of life behind those bleeding eyes. Rakshasa had doomed itself to a millennia as a rudimentary life support, because Joshua Wall had finally left the building. Aoife followed suit, and locked the door behind her. You have been listening to The Witchdoctor of Strangelove, an episode of Pulp, Surreal Stories from a Nearby Skull, written and directed by Jake Lucy. This production is copyright 2020 by the Sleepy Bones Detective Agency, and is intended for enjoyment purposes only. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. If you would like to support the show, please visit our Patreon at patreon.com/SBDA. Please visit us on the web at sleepybones.agency for more surreal stories.